Good evening, students of British and American culture. Today is the third part of the Week 10 lectures. It is my plan to go back to just 2 lectures next week. We're going to, now that we're in the 20th century, as it says, 20th century boy, I'm going to bring us up to World War II today, and then we're going to, next week, rewind right back to 1900 and then describe the whole century in terms of an American perspective. Next week's lecture is going to be called The American Century, and that will be largely based on the chapter in the textbook. But for now, what I'm teaching you here is sort of new material which I've started to add since the textbook was printed. So this will probably make it, as I said before, some things are being prepped to go into the 3rd edition if there is one. So I want to talk to you today, excuse me, I want to talk to you today about some basic concepts just to round out what we're talking about as the American culture makes a transition from its 19th century identity to its 20th century identity. And I think you can call that an evolution because it happens in sort of stages, but there are certain moments that are definitely accelerated, and again, if you're going to talk about revolution in a strict sense, it's going to be fast, and there's going to be a dramatic difference between before and after, and probably violence involved. But the only thing here that's missing really is the violence. But I'm going to talk about innovation, these 3 things: the entrepreneurial spirit of America, innovation, and the victory, ultimately the victory in World War II. As I said to you before, in terms of what you need to know for the exam, the video lectures are the primary resource, followed by the textbook, then the website, and then anything else that I add beyond that, including the slides that are there for the entire class. But that's the slides are just sort of backup. They're not really something that I've been following for the last 3 years, but they do have pictures and they do summarize a lot of the things. But anything in the slides that you haven't heard from the book or from me, disregard. Don't worry about knowing all the slides. There's 260 of them or something, and half of them probably are less relevant now than they were when I made them 3 or 4 years ago. Okay, so those are not really up to date. Focus on this lecture first. The entrepreneurial spirit really is something that in Korea we are trying to cultivate. And the last president, whether you liked her or not, one of the things that she was interested in doing was working on startups and small business and a creative economy and stuff like that. And well, I can't say she was successful or unsuccessful. It's not my job to comment on that, especially as a foreigner who doesn't have a good command of Hangul. But the idea, I thought, I agreed with the concept. If she didn't implement, that's another thing. But the reason that she was interested in doing that in Korea is because that is what people see as something that Americans do well, right? There's good things and bad things about America. We've been talking about both. But one of the things that people admire about Americans and about the culture of America, and it doesn't matter where you're from, you can become America, it doesn't matter what you look like and what your country of origin is. That has nothing to do with it. It's that you go to America and it's this environment of, there's this drive to be ambitious and to take control of your own destiny. It's not manifest destiny here, it's controlling your own, becoming your own boss, making your own company and driving yourself forward and ultimately becoming powerful, wealthy, and respected. This is the American dream, right? And I don't use that term very much because I think it's cliche and overused. And it's very, for most people, it's very, the American dream is an idea that the reality is sort of disconnected from it in a very shocking way for a lot of people. They make it there, or some people do. They come from countries that the situation is very dire. There's civil war, there's strife, there's violence, and making it to America is a realization of their dream. But for example, when you're talking about tens of millions of people in America who are poor, can barely get by, and don't have proper health care, then you're talking about sort of a contrast to what people believe the American dream offers. People make arguments like, well, they're poor, but they have iPhones. Yeah, they do, but if they get sick, they have an iPhone, but they can't pay for their cancer treatment. So, you can be living on the line, and then just everything can just shatter, and everything that's just good enough can just suddenly disappear from underneath you, and the safety nets are pretty weak. So anyway, we're going to talk about that in a few weeks. But what I'm talking about right now is the type of person who it doesn't matter about social safety networks or what the government wants you to do. They're the people that take the initiative and pull themselves up by their own bootstraps, so to speak. And through their ambition, their drive, their ingenuity, their confidence in themselves, and sometimes their desperation. A lot of these really successful businessmen come from backgrounds that are very poor and very desperate, and that sort of drives them forward to become these titans, these tycoons of business. I want to give you one particular example because we don't have time to talk about all of these people, but Rockefeller, Carnegie, Vanderbilt, I think I mentioned them already. If I didn't, these are just names that just everybody knows because they became fabulously rich, and they created commercial empires based around their industry, primarily oil, railroad, and steel. Now, when you go into the 20th century, it's not railroads and steel and shipping and canals that allow the movement of goods, and oil is still a big thing. Rockefeller has his company broken up because he just gets too dominant, and it almost represents a security problem for the state. So they break up his company, but that's off topic again. So these guys, these men, there aren't any women, unfortunately. Someday I'm sure there will be. Oprah now has an empire, and she's extremely wealthy. You might look at her as sort of a 20th century or late 20th century, 21st century example of the entrepreneurial spirit. But for now, these guys, they were obsessive and constantly innovating so that their companies were extremely competitive, and their companies became so competitive and so effective that they sort of choked out their competition. Intentionally, yes, but basically out of sort of a capitalist, survival of the fittest environment. So this entrepreneurial spirit is what drives these businessmen forward. And I want to talk about Henry Ford, because Henry Ford is credited with the invention of the assembly line. And I talked about World War I in the first lecture, so I want to come back to that again. And the second transportation revolution, the second industrial revolution, revolves around the creation of the combustion engine, which was created in created in Germany. It was invented in Germany by a man named Daimler, and you might know that if you like cars. Daimler Chrysler. Daimler was an inventor, German inventor, and he created a combustion engine. Before that, there were cars, but the cars were really running on, first industrial steam power kind of machinery. He had managed to make a working car operating with a combustion engine. And then shortly after that, Carl Benz, and you all know Benz because of Mercedes-Benz. I know Koreans love those cars, and I'm sure those of you from other countries do too. Carl Benz, shortly after that, created one too. So in America, they started doing this too. The first American car was called Oldsmobile, and when I read about this a couple of years ago, I was like, I had an Oldsmobile when I was young. My parents had one. But this Oldsmobile was pretty basic. It was in 1893, I believe, and it actually didn't have a steering wheel. It was only 3 horsepower, so if you had 3 horses to pull something, it's the same power as this car. But it had a lever, so you had to steer it like you're steering a ship or something. But the thing about this car, the Oldsmobile, was it was $650, which in today's prices is a lot more than that. But that was a price that was attainable for more people. It wasn't just the rich people, because before that, before these cars started to be mass produced, the only people who had cars were the super rich. So you can think of cars at the very beginning as being like private jets. So if you can buy a private jet now, you're in a certain level of society, and you have a certain amount of wealth that's not the norm. It's the top fraction of the society. But what Henry Ford did is he started to mass produce cars so that they were reliable enough. The Oldsmobile was pretty crappy, the steering wheel and the 3 horsepower. But he made a car called the Model T, which eventually sold more than 10 million, about 15 million units, which is a huge number. So we're talking about almost middle class people buying these things. He made it affordable. It was under $1,000, and the way that he managed to do this was by making an assembly line, and this is the difference. So when you built a car or anything else in the past, you had a team of people and you assembled the car or whatever machine as a team, and each person. So you actually learned how to build a car from the bottom up. So all of the people in the team were capable of doing, different roles. Some people were better at certain things, but you would basically learn the whole process of building a car. But what Henry Ford decided to do was have one person, weld the frame, and then one person, build the exhaust pipe, and one person drill the bolts into the frame, and then one person would, put the chassis on. And each person, there was a long line, and there was 100 people, and each person just did one part. And at the end of the line, after all the people had done their specific task, the thing would be completed. I think you probably know how this works. But the problem with that, of course, is that's extremely boring to just put the same piece on and drill a few, bolts into it and then pass it on, and then get the next piece and drill it on. It was incredibly boring and monotonous, and people hated it. In fact, the turnover rate for his company was ridiculous. Like, people would quit after 3 or 4 months. So, in 1 year, there would be like a 300% turnover rate. We're talking about, the entire workforce flipping over 3 times in 1 year. So training and loss of skilled labor was a huge problem. But he solved this by giving benefits and higher salary and time off, and sort of offering, what we call benefits to his workers, which was also sort of revolutionary because in the Industrial Revolution, both in England and Germany and America or anywhere else, there's a tendency for factory owners just to work people as hard as they can, sometimes work them to death, and not care about their safety or their health or their happiness. But Henry Ford started to try to keep his workers happier and motivated, and to reduce the turnover and to encourage loyalty to the company. So this is all new stuff. It's very revolutionary. Now, the reason that there's an interesting story too about how he came up with the idea of an assembly line, because apparently one of his associates, when he was building the cars, they had gone to look at basically a meat packing plant, and in a meat and remember, don't go and visit one of these. It's a slaughterhouse. It's where they kill cows or chickens or whatever, and to prepare them for your dinner, for your plate. The Germans say if you want to enjoy your sausage, well, I don't know exactly what the expression is, but something like if you want to eat a sausage, don't visit the sausage factory, because the process is pretty. It makes you lose your appetite seeing the process of making the meat. But anyway, basically what they had done in this slaughterhouse is that they were basically disassembling animals. So the cow would come in and they would kill all the cows, and then they would cut all the cows piece by piece. And it would go down the line, just like an assembly line, except for it was a disassembly line. So they would cut the pieces off and remove them as they went down, until at the end, the cow was completely separated into its different cuts of meat. And apparently, that gave them the inspiration for an assembly line. Instead of cutting something up, taking something apart in a line, piece by piece, why don't we build it in a line, piece by piece? And that's where the assembly line came from. And yes, we all know the Ford company. It's not the most dominant car company in the world anymore. It's still an influential, it's a gigantic company still. But back then, at one point, before in the 1920s, the Americans were the ones. We're talking about 70%. More than 70% of the entire fleet of cars in the world. Like, American companies are producing more than half. The majority of cars and the majority of drivers, the majority of buyers and sellers and companies are American. They're completely dominant in the car industry, and this is largely because of people like Henry Ford. Between 1890 and 1910. There were almost 480 something car companies get started, right? That's the entrepreneurial spirit. You know, there's only like 10 or 15 of them left now, but 500 people attempted to make their own car companies. And some of them, not all of them failed right away. Some of them were successful and they sold their company and they became rich. Some people just messed up, but that is the kind of thing that happens in America, is when there's a new technology, and you can see this in other situations too, like when all of you were not quite born yet, but in the 1990s, the .com, the internet technology was new, and the .com bubble happened, and there was hundreds and hundreds of new companies, and most of them failed, and most of them disappeared, but some of them got bought out, and some of them sold their patents or whatever. Lots of people, their companies disappeared, but they cashed out because other companies, in the spirit of competition, bought them out, or marginalized them, or whatever. And I can't explain all these examples without eating up too much time, but each time, this happened repeatedly since the late 20th century, that America has been on the leading edge of a new technology, and that they have, many individuals have got into it. Now, you can see it happening in China and other countries now too. The Chinese have got the same sort of drive and interest and ambition. And there's new companies popping up all the time. Alibaba is a great example of that. I'm not familiar with all the Chinese companies because I don't use many of them, but there are thousands of them. And that's an American thing. It's a Chinese thing too, but the American cultural thing goes right back for hundreds of years, and to a certain extent, other countries, when they develop it, what they're doing is looking at America as a model for a business attitude and an industrial, innovative effort. And what they're trying to do is achieve the same level of success that the Americans have before too. Now, this constant drive for innovation, I just talked about this. This is something that I can't say that America has lost it, or they're losing it, or they still. It's not relevant because it's too fresh for us to really know if America is still leading in all the categories that it used to. But again, this is a cultural studies class, so that the cultures go up and down. And if America is not right now, like the coronavirus is making things very difficult for American life in general, and there's cultural reasons for that too. And I don't want to try and analyze that, because that's a very dangerous topic. You usually have to. It's much easier to look back at a crisis and sort of analyze it when you've got more information, and you can separate yourself a little bit to be more objective. But my gut, my instincts tells me that every culture has its advantages, and cultures change. And at a certain time, this is one of the things I want to emphasize in this class, is that these cultures have changed. Some of the things are fundamental, but they can all change. But there is not, you cannot just disconnect yourself completely from the entire existence. It permeates your education, your politics, your economics, your daily life, your personal life. That's what culture is. Culture is life. Now, if American culture and American lifestyle makes them more vulnerable to the coronavirus, then that's going to be a disadvantage. And if American life and American individualism and American entrepreneurial spirit and American independence and love of free speech and patriotism gives them an advantage in fighting in World War I or fighting in World War II, then that's what's going to happen, right? A lot of it is about actual, measurable statistical things. But there's also something about the way you're as a group you're going to behave. So there is a strong entrepreneurial spirit. It's there. You can tell. If you're not going to see a difference individually. You're going to see a Korean person with a strong entrepreneurial spirit, and you're going to meet an American who doesn't. An American who just has no interest in risking anything. They just want to get their education and get a day job and pay their bills, and that's enough. And then you're going to find a Korean or a Chinese person or somebody from Uzbekistan or whatever, Bangladesh, and they're going to say, I'm going to risk everything. I'm going to borrow as much money as possible. I got a great idea. I'm going to start my business, and I'm going to go for it. I'm going to get investors in it, and they're going to go for it. And some of them are going to succeed, and some of them are going to fail. But that's what this is. Okay. Now the ability to keep that effort going and not to fall behind and not to have your company collapse. Be less competitive or something is what I mean by innovation. So Carnegie, Ford, Rockefeller, those guys, one of the things that's common amongst them, besides the attitude, is the fact that they were constantly upgrading their factories. Even though it was very expensive to just completely change an entire factory, if that gave them an advantage, that gave them the ability to get a step up on the other people in the field, they did it. They spent the money. They bit the bullet. They invested heavily and lost. Maybe they lost some ground temporarily, but a few years later, when the British companies, for example, in the textile industry or in the steel industry, when they didn't upgrade, they would, be more competitive for a couple years. But then Carnegie in the United States had a new process and all this new equipment, and then 3 years later, he would be destroying them because he would be making better quality steel at a lower cost, faster. And so the long-term investment, this is what we call R&D now, is also a fundamental thing of the American business culture and the American industrial effort that started in the Civil War. We talked about the Civil War. It started about 60 years before this, but in the beginning of the 20th century, it really picks up, and you just have all of these industries. So when they go into World War II, the industrial power of the American state is incredible. It's when Japan, some things people don't realize is when Japan picks a fight with the United States, yes, Japan was ready. Yes, they bombed Pearl Harbor, and they had aircraft carriers and giant battleships and veteran soldiers and everything. But ultimately, there was never any chance of Japan beating the United States because the industrial capacity and the access to resources of the United States was so big that even if Japan made it all the way to California, by the time they got there, basically the American state had an industrial capacity somewhere around 20 times larger than Japan. You can't, if there's that much equipment and that much technology being produced, 20 to 1, if the war isn't over very quickly, which it couldn't be, because America's too big, the distances are too far, you're going to lose. So there was never, despite the fact that Pearl Harbor resulted in a disaster, in a tragedy, and a shock to the American people, Japan was very badly mistaken and miscalculated about their chances of having a direct confrontation with the United States. And not only did the United States fight Japan, but they decided to fight Germany on the other side too. Now, this is what I mean by victory here. What America's participation meant. And they didn't initially want to be involved, but the surprise attack by Japan caused the American people to really shift their opinion. They were really not in favor of it. There were some people that wanted to be involved, but for the most part, Americans wanted to be, didn't want to risk, especially because of the Depression was still being overcome. That they didn't want to risk, destabilization, their money, their lives, for somebody else's fight. It wasn't really, nobody was really attacking America. But when the Japanese invaded Pearl Harbor, they did FDR a favor because then it was war, because they had provoked. They had started the war. There are reasons why they did that, because the United States was blocking resources. They weren't selling oil. They weren't selling metal. They weren't selling timber, lumber. They had basically blocked Japan's access to the American market and frozen their assets. So in some ways, Japan had no choice. But basically, them attacking first created a situation where the American people supported the war. And right after that, Hitler declared war on America too, which was a serious mistake as well. Germany was already going to lose against Russia anyway. The real heroes, let me be clear, the real heroes of World War II, despite what you think of communism and despite what you think of Joseph Stalin, because he was a terrible man in some ways, it was Russia who won the war. It was Russia who sacrificed the lives and stopped Germany and won the war and defeated Hitler. That was Russia. On the other hand, would Russia have been able to do that without the United States? Maybe not. So we all give credit to the United States for beating Japan, which we should. But in terms of winning World War II, really there were multiple winners. But there was only one country that wasn't a loser, because even in winning, Russia paid a terrible, terrible cost. Undescribable suffering and cost of damage to their infrastructure, their cities, their economy. Close to over 25 million people died in Russia, in the Soviet Union, and that's 50 times higher than what the Americans paid in lives. And the only real damage that America suffered was in Hawaii. There wasn't really any damage to their infrastructure, to their buildings. Just they paid in lives, and they paid in money, and equipment, and suffering, for the loss of family members and of American citizens. So I'm not minimizing that, but basically, geographically, physically, the United States came out almost untouched, whereas every other country in the conflict, major player in the conflict, United Kingdom was bombed, Germany was destroyed, France escaped a lot of it, but they were, under the control of the Germans for 5 years. Poland was completely destroyed in both directions. Every other country was laid waste, except for the United States. So at the end, although Russia was certainly a superpower still and had lots of military capacity and was very powerful, they took so much damage to their state that really America stood alone as the only real superpower at the end of World War II. And the ultimate conclusion of World War II was the dropping of the atomic weapons on 2 Japanese cities, Hiroshima and Nagasaki. And that represented, again, not the entrepreneurial spirit certainly, but the drive to innovation, that the Americans had the money and the effort and the organization to start the Manhattan Project and see it concluded by 1945, so that they were the only country in the world that possessed this nuclear weapon, which would soon change as the Russians developed one a few years later. But at the end of World War II, the United States basically stood astride the world like a colossus. Never in the history of the world has there been a country that was more in control of the planet than in 1945. Basically, Russia controlled Asia, if you might argue that, and the rest of the world was under the United States' control for a very brief period of time. And a lot of that influence remains today. So that's why I wanted to talk about the effort, the attitude, the culture that created this environment, and that the isolationist idea by the end of World War II has basically finally, after a period of about 50 years of hesitancy and waiting, and only being pushed into things as sort of it will collapse, and Truman will drop the bombs, and after somebody has to fill the vacuum, and it's going to be either Russia or America, and that's essentially what creates the Cold War, is that there's only 2 choices. There's Russia to take your cues from, or America, and so the world sort of starts to the 2 superpowers start to branch out and try to influence other states in order to support themselves, to create a sort of perimeter around themselves, and to help all of those countries recover to a certain extent. And this is the America that we know now. This is the America that was required to win the war in World War II is the one that you see operating today. And when Donald Trump got elected, one of the things he said is he was going to withdraw, he was going to cut the military spending, And a lot of people thought that idea was good, and including me. I mean, you need to let countries, you don't want to let countries hurt their own people, but to a certain extent, you need to allow countries to develop themselves and support themselves, and you need people in sovereign states to build their own structures and to let their own cultures adapt to modern life without the presence of American politics, investment, companies, and military. But he was unable to do that. We all know that there's still soldiers in Japan and South Korea and Afghanistan, and he pulled Donald Trump pulled people out of Syria, and the results were pretty terrible. It's kind of a very complicated game that has been going on for the last 75 years, and this is all basically a consequence of this global superpower presence that the Americans managed to. I mean, because of all of the other powers, the damage to all the other powers, there was no choice really. Somebody had to take the reins. Part of the reason that they did is because after World War I, the United States stepped back, and then the whole thing sort of reset, and then Germany tried to do it again. So, the United Nations is also a product of this victory that the Russians and the British and the French and the Americans decided that they would be the leaders of the world. And everything is changing now, but this is the culture. Still, you can see how this culture influences everything up until today. A lot of the international organizations that we have are basically, I wouldn't say they're controlled, but they're supported by American money, American politics, American effort, so this is the modern world. This is the 21st century world we're dealing with. So that's it. That's my lecture. It took a little longer than I expected, but the entrepreneurial spirit, many different examples of that, going right up to Bill Gates and Steve Jobs, is the same kind of story that continues. Oprah, I mentioned. Innovation is something that Americans prize. You got Silicon Valley in California, and young people, educated people, constantly try to come up with new ways of doing business and solving problems. You all know Zuckerberg and Google and all those other technology companies we're familiar with, Instagram. These are all due to the innovative impulse of American culture. And like I said, I mean, there's a lot of negative side effects of being for a long time the only superpower, and sometimes it seems like America is going to withdraw from that, but we need something to replace it. So for now, the victory, America's victory and Russia's victory, but especially America's victory in World War II, has handed down to us this environment that we have to deal with, which still includes America as the premier country, the culture that people look up to, and the leaders of the global community. And that is it for the 20th century for this week. Next week, I'll talk about the American century in a way to organize the different parts and the experience of it. And the week after that, I'm going to talk about Hollywood and pop culture. And then the week after that, we'll wrap things up by talking about the American political system and the justice system, and what you need to study for the exam. Remember, this Thursday, your graded assignment is due on one of the 5 points that I introduced to you about American ideals, and that's due. I know there was a mistake about the date on the website, which is fixed, but it's due at the very latest, midnight, May 14th, this Thursday. Thank you for listening, and have a good night.